"What happened to me was terrible," she began, her voice clear and strong. "But what happened after shows the power of a community that refuses to accept injustice. Every braid in my hair today represents someone who stood up, spoke out, or made a change. We're all connected now, woven together like these strands, stronger together than we ever could be alone. The changes weren't perfect, and there was still work to be done. But Maya's story had become a beacon of hope, proving that even the darkest moments could lead to light. Her grandmother had been right. She had grown back stronger. Not just her hair, but her spirit, her community, and her belief in the possibility of change." As she finished her speech, Maya touched one of her new braids, feeling its strength beneath her fingers. Each plait told a story of loss and recovery, of injustice and justice, of hatred and love. But the morning sun streamed through the windows of Roosevelt High School as students rushed to their first period classes. Among them was Michelle Chen, a senior who'd never been in trouble before. Her dark curly hair was neatly pulled back, and she wore her usual confident smile as she headed to AP Chemistry, where she'd been maintaining a perfect grade all year. But today was different. As she walked past the main office, a stern voice stopped her in her tracks. "Miss Chen." Principal Davidson's voice boomed through the hallway. "Come here immediately." Michelle's heart skipped a beat. She'd never been called to the principal's office before. As president of the science club and editor of the school newspaper, she was known for following rules, not breaking them. Principal Davidson stood in his doorway, his arms crossed. He was a tall man with graying hair and cold eyes that seemed to judge everyone they fell upon. "Your shirt," he said, pointing at her collar. "It's not within dress code." Michelle looked down at her outfit, a simple blue button-up blouse she'd worn dozens of times before. The top button was undone, showing a modest necklace her grandmother had given her for her 17th birthday. "But Mr. Davidson," she started, her voice steady despite her racing heart, "I've worn the same blouse all year. None of my teachers have ever said anything about it." Just then, a group of cheerleaders walked by, their skirts notably shorter than the dress code allowed. Principal Davidson didn't even glance their way. "Don't talk back to me," he snapped, his face reddening. "This is exactly the kind of disrespect I'm talking about. Into my office, now." Inside his office, Michelle sat quietly as Principal Davidson pulled up her student file on his computer. Her perfect attendance record, her 4.0 GPA, and her long list of extracurricular activities filled the screen. Well, he muttered, scrolling through her achievements with an expression that looked more like disappointment than pride. "Seems you think being a good student means you can do whatever you want." "Sir, I really don't understand," Michelle said softly, fighting back tears. "If there's something wrong with my blouse, I can button it up, or I have my sweater in my locker." 3 days suspension, he interrupted, already filling out the disciplinary form. "For dress code violation and insubordination." Michelle's world seemed to stop. "But sir, I have a chemistry test today. And the science club meeting after school. We're planning the science fair." "Should have thought about that before you decided to break the rules," he said without looking up. "Your kind always think you're above the rules." The words hit Michelle like a physical blow. She knew exactly what he meant by your kind, and it had nothing to do with her being a good student. A young teacher, Ms. Rivera, happened to be walking past the office just then. She paused briefly, her eyes meeting Michelle's through the glass partition. Something in that look told Michelle she wasn't alone. "I'll need to call your parents," Principal Davidson said, reaching for his phone. "My mom's at work at the hospital," Michelle replied quietly. "She's a nurse in the ICU. She can't take calls during her shift." Most importantly, they told the story of a community that had learned to stand together, proving that when ordinary people choose to do what's right, extraordinary change is possible. "Then you'd better start walking home," he said dismissively, sliding the suspension notice across his desk. "And don't come back until you learn to follow the rules." As Michelle gathered her belongings from her locker, her hands trembling, she didn't know that Ms. Rivera was watching from around the corner, her phone discreetly recording everything. She didn't know that her best friend was texting their group chat about what had just happened. She didn't know that the security cameras had caught Principal Davidson ignoring multiple dress code violations from other students that very morning. All Michelle knew was that she had to walk home alone, clutching her backpack to her chest, trying to understand how her perfect senior year had just been derailed over a button on her blouse. But sometimes life has a way of bringing justice when you least expect it, and for Principal Davidson, that justice was already in motion, even if he didn't know it yet. Walking home under the bright morning sun, Michelle finally let her tears fall. But these weren't just tears of sadness, they were tears of anger, of determination, and of a fighting spirit that refused to be broken. Little did she know, her story was about to spark a change that would reach far beyond the walls of Roosevelt High. Ms. Rivera stood in her empty classroom during her free period, her hands shaking slightly as she opened her laptop. For the past 8 months, she'd been quietly keeping track of every disciplinary action at Roosevelt High, and what she saw had kept her up at night. She pulled out a worn blue notebook from her desk drawer. Inside were dates, names, and incidents, all meticulously documented. Next to it sat a USB drive containing emails, photographs, and video clips she'd collected. As a first-year teacher, she knew she was risking her career, but seeing Michelle Chen walk out of school in tears was the final straw. Opening her spreadsheet, she added today's incident to her records. The numbers were startling. Students of color received suspensions at 3 times the rate of their white classmates for the exact same infractions. But it wasn't just the numbers, it was the pattern of behavior she'd witnessed. Just last week, she'd seen 2 students running in the hallway. The white student got a verbal warning, while the Asian student received detention. 3 days ago, a black student was sent home for having distracting hair while wearing the same hairstyle many other students wore without comment. Her phone buzzed. A text from Mr. Kumar, the physics teacher. "Did you see what happened to Michelle? This has gone too far." Ms. Rivera's mind flashed back to her own high school days when she'd stood by silently watching similar injustices. "Not this time," she whispered to herself. She began compiling her evidence. Screenshots of the school's security footage showed Principal Davidson ignoring dress code violations from certain students while harshly punishing others. Her spreadsheet revealed that since Davidson became principal 2 years ago, honor roll participation among minority students had dropped by 40%. Many had transferred to other schools, unable to handle the constant scrutiny and unfair treatment. As she worked, more texts poured in from other teachers. Mr. Kumar shared how Principal Davidson had blocked his proposal for a cultural diversity celebration. Mrs. Thompson from the English department forwarded emails showing how Davidson had rejected club funding requests from minority student groups while approving similar requests from others. A knock on her classroom door made her jump. It was Lily Wong, one of her brightest students, tears in her eyes. "Ms. Rivera, can I talk to you?" Lily's voice trembled. "It's about what happened to Michelle. She's my lab partner, and this isn't the first time Principal Davidson has done something like this." For the next 20 minutes, Ms. Rivera listened as Lily described incidents she'd witnessed over the past 2 years. She took careful notes, her resolve strengthening with each word. "Thank you for telling me this, Lily," Ms. Rivera said gently. "You're very brave to speak up." After Lily left, Ms. Rivera received an email that made her gasp. It was from a teacher at Davidson's previous school, responding to her inquiry from last week. The message confirmed her suspicions. Davidson had left his last position under similar circumstances, but the complaints had been buried. Looking at the clock, Ms. Rivera realized only an hour had passed since Michelle's suspension. She organized her evidence into clear, undeniable proof of systematic discrimination. Her hands were steady now as she prepared emails to the school board, the teachers' union, and the Department of Education. Just then, her classroom door opened again. It was Mrs. Washington, the school counselor, a woman who'd worked at Roosevelt High for 20 years. "I saw everything," Mrs. Washington said quietly, closing the door behind her. "And I have something you need to see." She placed a thick folder on Ms. Rivera's desk, 2 years' worth of student complaints that Davidson had pressured her to lose. Mrs. Washington's eyes were firm with determination. "I've been keeping copies. I knew someday someone would be brave enough to stand up to him. I think that day is today." Ms. Rivera looked at the growing mountain of evidence on her desk. In just 1 hour, the truth had begun to snowball. She thought of Michelle walking home alone, not knowing that justice was already in motion. She thought of every student who'd ever left school feeling less than they were because of one man's prejudice. Taking a deep breath, Ms. Rivera began to type. Her email to the school board started with 6 simple words. We need to talk about Principal Davidson. The quiet afternoon hallway held no hint of the storm that was about to break. But sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest actions: a teacher taking notes, a student speaking up, a counselor saving papers. And now, all those small actions were about to come together in a way that would change Roosevelt High forever. The news spread through Roosevelt High like wildfire. By lunchtime, everyone knew about Michelle Chen's unfair suspension. The usually noisy cafeteria had a different energy today. Clusters of students huddled over their phones, sharing stories and messages of support. Did you see what Jenny posted? A sophomore whispered to her friend, holding up her phone. The post showed Michelle and Jenny in their science club lab coats, beaming after winning first place at last year's state competition. The caption read, "This is my friend Michelle. Perfect grades. Never breaks rules. Suspended for a button. But we all know the real reason. Time to speak up. #Justice for Michelle." The hashtag was catching fire. Students began sharing their own experiences, each story adding fuel to the growing outrage. Amy Park described how Principal Davidson had mocked her accent during morning announcements. David Rodriguez posted about being denied advanced placement despite his qualifying scores. The stories kept coming. In the teacher's lounge, phones were buzzing nonstop. Parents were flooding the school's office with calls and emails. Mrs. Lee, whose daughter was in Michelle's chemistry class, had already called 5 other parents. "My daughter told me everything," she said firmly to another concerned mother. "We're not letting this slide, not this time." Local community groups started sharing the story. The Asian American Community Center posted a statement of support. The local education advocacy group Equal Education Now reached out to Michelle's family, offering legal assistance. Even former students began chiming in with their own stories about Principal Davidson's behavior. Back in the cafeteria, Lali Wong stood on a chair, her voice trembling but determined. "Listen up, everyone. We're starting a peaceful protest. We'll wear our regular clothes tomorrow. Nothing inappropriate, just normal clothes. Let's see him try to suspend all of us." The plan spread quickly through text messages and social media. Parents got involved, promising to support their children's right to protest peacefully. Local news stations began picking up the story, intrigued by the students' organized response. By afternoon, the school board's inbox was overwhelmed. Board member Mrs. Thompson sat at her desk, scrolling through hundreds of emails. One caught her eye. It was from a former student who'd graduated 2 years ago. "I left Roosevelt High because of Principal Davidson," the email read. "I was an A student, but he made me feel worthless every day. I transferred schools and got into Yale. But I always regretted not speaking up about what he did. Now I'm seeing all these posts, and I know I have to add my voice. Here's what happened." Meanwhile, at the local coffee shop near school, 3 alumni who'd seen the social media storm met up to share their stories. They started a group chat that quickly grew to over 50 former students, all with similar experiences to share. The owner of the coffee shop, Mr. Zhang, had been serving Roosevelt High students for 20 years. He'd noticed how some of his regular customers had stopped coming to school events over the past 2 years, but he never knew why. Now, listening to their stories, he felt his own anger rising. He grabbed his phone and called his friend at the local newspaper. At the public library across from school, the librarian, Mrs. Patel, was helping students print flyers for their peaceful protest. She'd worked at Roosevelt High before Davidson arrived and had left because of his behavior. Now, seeing these young people standing up for justice, she felt a surge of hope. The local civil rights organization office received dozens of calls that afternoon. Their director, Dr. Harris, listened carefully to each story, taking detailed notes. "This isn't just about one suspension," she told her staff. "This is about systematic discrimination that needs to end." As the sun began to set, Michelle sat in her room, overwhelmed by the hundreds of supportive messages flooding her phone. Her mother, home from her hospital shift, sat beside her, reading through the outpouring of community support. "I thought I was alone," Michelle whispered, tears in her eyes. Her mother hugged her tight. "Look at all these people standing with you. You were never alone, sweetheart. And tomorrow, everyone will know it." Outside, cars honked in support as they passed students holding handmade signs near the school. Local news vans parked across the street, preparing for their evening broadcasts. Parents organized a community meeting for that night at the community center. The story had taken on a life of its own, growing bigger than just one student or one incident. It had become a movement, a community rising up to say enough is enough. And this was just the beginning. As night fell, phones across the city lit up with messages organizing for tomorrow. Students coordinated their peaceful protest. Parents prepared emails and phone calls. Teachers gathered their courage. Everyone knew that when the sun rose on Roosevelt High tomorrow, nothing would be the same. Principal Davidson sat alone in his office, unaware that his world was about to change forever. Sometimes karma doesn't just knock, it brings the whole community with it. The school board's emergency meeting room buzzed with tension as Ms. Rivera connected her laptop to the projector. It was 4:30 p.m., just hours after Michelle's suspension, but it felt like days had passed. The 7 board members leaned forward in their chairs, their faces serious as the first slides appeared on the screen. "What you're about to see," Ms. Rivera began, her voice steady despite her racing heart, "is 8 months of documented discrimination at Roosevelt High." The first video clip played, security footage from that very morning. Split-screen images showed Principal Davidson ignoring multiple dress code violations from certain students while singling out Michelle. The timestamp clearly showed all incidents happened within the same hour. "This isn't an isolated incident," Ms. Rivera continued, clicking to her next slide. Charts and graphs filled the screen, showing suspension rates broken down by student demographics. The numbers were impossible to ignore. Board member Mr. Chen removed his glasses, rubbing his eyes. "How long has this been going on?" Mrs. Washington, the school counselor, stepped forward. She placed her folder of hidden complaint forms on the table. 2 years, she said quietly, since Principal Davidson arrived. The investigation team from the Department of Education arrived while the meeting was still in progress. 2 investigators in formal attire took seats at the back, their tablets ready. They'd received not just Ms. Rivera's email, but dozens of complaints from parents and community members in the past few hours. "We need to see all disciplinary records from the past 2 years," the lead investigator announced. "Every suspension, every detention, every warning." The school's IT manager, Mr. Patel, pulled up the digital records. His fingers flew across the keyboard as he accessed file after file. "There's something odd here," he said, frowning. "Some records have been modified recently." The younger investigator leaned in. "When exactly?" "This afternoon," Mr. Patel replied, "right after the suspension incident." The room grew quiet. Attempting to alter official school records was a serious offense. Meanwhile, in another room, 3 students sat with a second investigation team, sharing their recorded experiences. Lely Wong played a video from last month's school assembly where Principal Davidson had made discriminatory remarks. Another student shared screenshots of emails where Davidson had denied club funding requests with clearly biased explanations. The evidence kept mounting. The school's head secretary brought in a stack of college recommendation letters. Notice how his letters for certain students are always 3 paragraphs long, very generic. But for others, she pulled out comparison letters. The differences were striking. Back in the main meeting room, Ms. Rivera shared her most damning evidence yet, testimony from teachers at Davidson's previous school. "He left suddenly in the middle of a term," she explained. The official reason was personal matters, but these emails tell a different story. The investigators scrolled through their tablets, connecting dots. One looked up sharply. "This pattern goes back further than 2 years. We need to contact his previous districts." By 6 p.m., the school's security team had pulled every camera footage from the past month. The technology teacher, Mrs. Kim, had recovered deleted emails from the server backup. 3 more former students had come forward with documented incidents. "Look at this," Mr. Kumar said, pointing to his computer screen. The college acceptance rates for minority students had dropped significantly under Davidson's leadership, while their transfer-out rates had skyrocketed. The investigation team set up a hotline for current and former students to report incidents. Within an hour, they had over 50 calls. Each story fit the pattern, adding another piece to the puzzle. Outside the school, news crews gathered as word of the investigation spread. Parents stood in small groups, sharing stories they'd never told before. "I thought it was just my kid," one mother said, wiping tears. "I had no idea how many families were suffering." The investigators worked through dinner, ordering pizza as they dug deeper into school records. Every new piece of evidence reinforced what Ms. Rivera had discovered. This wasn't about one suspension or one student. It was about years of systematic discrimination hidden behind a veneer of authority. At 8 p.m., the lead investigator closed her laptop. The evidence was overwhelming. She picked up her phone to make a call to the superintendent. This wasn't just going to be a report. This would require immediate action. In the parking lot, Ms. Rivera finally headed to her car, exhausted but relieved. As she walked, she saw Michelle's mother arriving for her scheduled meeting with the investigation team. They exchanged a knowing look, one that said justice was finally in motion. The school stood quiet in the evening darkness, its windows reflecting the lights of news vans and departing cars. Tomorrow would bring more revelations, more evidence, more stories. But tonight, the truth was already out, and there would be no putting it back in the shadows. Principal Davidson's office sat dark and empty, his nameplate gleaming faintly in the hallway light. By this time tomorrow, that nameplate would be gone, and with it, the fear and discrimination that had ruled Roosevelt High for far too long. The school board meeting room had never been so packed. Every seat was taken, with people lining the walls and spilling out into the hallway. The air conditioning hummed quietly, barely cutting through the tension that filled the room. It was 7:00 p.m., exactly 2 days after Michelle's unfair suspension. Board President Mrs. Yu called the meeting to order, Belgavel's sharp rap bringing immediate silence. "Before we begin," she announced, her voice firm but tired after reviewing evidence all day, "I want to thank everyone for their patience during this investigation." Principal Davidson sat at the front, his usual confident smile replaced by a tight-lipped frown. His lawyer shuffled papers beside him, looking increasingly worried as Mrs. Torres, the lead investigator, approached the podium. "Our investigation has revealed a pattern of systematic discrimination spanning multiple schools over 10 years, Mrs. Torres began. The projector hummed to life behind her, displaying the first of many damning slides. For the next 45 minutes, she laid out the evidence. The room stayed eerily quiet as she showed the data: suspension rates, funding discrepancies, altered records, buried complaints. With each new revelation, Davidson seemed to shrink further into his chair. At Roosevelt High alone, Mrs. Torres continued, we found over 200 documented incidents of discriminatory behavior in just 2 years. She clicked to the next slide, showing a chart of student transfers. Notice how minority student enrollment dropped by 35% under Principal Davidson's leadership, while academic performance gaps widened significantly. In the audience, Michelle sat between her mother and Ms. Rivera. Her hands trembled slightly as Mrs. Torres shared screenshots of Davidson's emails about her, messages that revealed his true attitudes hidden behind professional language. Mr. Chen, the board's vice president, leaned forward. And you're certain these records weren't altered? Every document has been verified, Mrs. Torres confirmed. We have original copies, digital timestamps, and witness testimonies from all 5 schools where Principal Davidson worked. Davidson's lawyer stood up, attempting to interrupt. My client maintains that these incidents were all within standard disciplinary guidelines. Let me stop you there, Mrs. Yu interjected. She pulled out a thick folder. We have here signed statements from 37 current and former teachers, documenting how Mr. Davidson explicitly instructed them to apply different standards to different students. The lawyer sat down heavily. Mrs. Washington, the school counselor, took the podium next. Her voice shook with emotion as she shared her hidden records of student complaints. I've been in education for 25 years, she said. I've never seen such a calculated effort to disadvantage certain students. As she spoke, more photos appeared on the screen. Empty club rooms where vibrant cultural organizations once met, cancelled college prep sessions, denied field trip requests. Each image told part of a larger story of systematic suppression. Principal Davidson finally stood up, his face red. This is ridiculous. You're taking everything out of context. Context. Ms. Rivera stepped forward, carrying her laptop. Let's talk about context. She played the security footage from Michelle's suspension, split-screened with similar incidents from the same day. The contrast was undeniable. The board members exchanged glances. Mrs. Yu cleared her throat. "I think we've seen enough. Principal Davidson, effective immediately, you are placed on administrative leave pending termination. Please surrender your school keys and credentials." A security officer stepped forward to escort Davidson from the building. As he walked out, students in the hallway turned their backs, a silent, powerful statement. But the meeting wasn't over. Mrs. Yu turned to Michelle and her mother. "On behalf of the school board, I want to offer our deepest apologies. Your suspension is not only reversed, but will be expunged from your record." The room erupted in applause. Tears streamed down Michelle's face as she hugged her mother. Furthermore, Mrs. Yu continued once the room quieted, "We're implementing immediate changes." She outlined new policies, mandatory anti-bias training for all staff, an independent review committee for disciplinary actions, and a student-led diversity council with real power to make changes. In the back of the auditorium, a news crew filmed quietly. Roosevelt High's transformation had become a story of hope for other schools facing similar challenges. Already, 3 other districts had reached out for guidance on implementing similar changes. But perhaps the biggest change, Michelle said, her voice softening, is how we see ourselves. We're not just students passing through. We're a community. When one of us faces injustice, we all stand together. When one of us succeeds, we all celebrate. She held up a small button, one of the Stand With Michelle badges students had made months ago. "I kept this to remind me that change is possible. That when we stand together, justice wins. That education really can be for everyone." The applause was deafening. Dr. Chen returned to the podium, announcing the school's newest initiative, a scholarship fund for students who showed exceptional commitment to fostering inclusivity and academic excellence. After the assembly in the sunny courtyard, students lingered to talk and take photos. The wall that once displayed only traditional academic achievements now showed a vibrant mix of accomplishments: artistic, cultural, academic, and athletic. Michelle found her mother in the crowd and hugged her tight. "I can't believe how different everything is now," she whispered. Her mother smiled. "Sometimes it takes one person's courage to help everyone else find theirs." As the day ended, the setting sun painted Roosevelt High's buildings in warm gold. Students walked out chattering about tomorrow's cultural food festival, next week's leadership workshop, and the upcoming student-led educational equity conference. Principal Davidson's discriminatory regime had become just a memory, a reminder of what happens when people stand up for what's right. In its place stood something beautiful, a school where every student could truly belong, learn, and thrive. The last students leaving campus passed under a new archway. Its words, chosen by the Student Council, summed up Roosevelt High's new chapter perfectly: enter to learn, leave to lead, return to inspire. 3 months had passed since that fateful school board meeting. The spring sunshine streamed through Roosevelt High's windows, catching the new banners that hung in the hallway: "Every student matters" and "Unity in diversity." The school felt different now, lighter, more welcoming, filled with the kind of energy that comes with positive change. Michelle stood at her locker, pinning up her latest achievement, an acceptance letter from Stanford University. Around her, other seniors were doing the same, their college acceptance letters creating a colorful patchwork of dreams across the hallway. "Ready for the assembly?" Lily asked, approaching with a camera hanging around her neck. As the school newspaper's new photographer, she'd been documenting the school's transformation. The auditorium was packed. Students, teachers, parents, and community members filled every seat. On stage, a banner announced, "Roosevelt High School Leadership Conference, Building an Inclusive Future." Dr. Grace Chen, their new principal, stepped up to the microphone. She was everything Davidson wasn't: warm, approachable, and genuinely committed to every student's success. In just 3 months, she transformed the school's atmosphere. "When I was asked to become principal here," Dr. Chen began, "I knew I was joining a community that had shown extraordinary courage. You didn't just fight against discrimination, you showed everyone what justice looks like in action." The changes were everywhere. The reinstated Cultural Awareness Club now had the school's largest membership. The student council had representatives from every grade and background. Even the school's architecture had changed. The principal's office now had glass walls, a symbol of transparency. Mrs. Washington, still the school counselor, smiled from her seat as she looked through her newest files. College acceptance rates had soared across all student groups. The achievement gap was steadily closing. Students who had transferred out were coming back. And now, Dr. Chen continued, "I'd like to invite our valedictorian to speak." Michelle walked to the podium, her graduation robes swishing softly. The audience burst into applause, not just for her academic achievements, but for her role in changing their school forever. 3 months ago, Michelle began, her voice clear and strong, I walked out of this school in tears, thinking my dreams were over. Today, I stand here knowing that sometimes what feels like your worst day can become the start of something amazing. In the audience, Ms. Rivera wiped away tears. Her careful documentation had not only exposed years of discrimination, but had become a model for other schools. The Department of Education was now using Roosevelt High's new policies as a template for districts across the state. But this isn't just my story, Michelle continued. Look around. Every person in this room played a part in making our school better. When my friends shared their stories, when teachers spoke up, when parents demanded change, that's when we learned what real education looks like. She gestured to the diverse group of students seated on stage, the new Student Leadership Council. Today, we're launching our peer mentoring program. Every incoming freshman will have a senior mentor to guide them. No student will ever feel alone or unsupported again. The presentation screen behind her showed photos from the past 3 months. Students from different backgrounds studying together in the library, cultural celebration days that had become monthly events, the new STEM club that had already won 2 regional competitions. And here's something amazing, Michelle added, her face brightening. Remember those college preparation sessions that used to get mysteriously cancelled? Last week, our student-led college prep team helped submit over 200 applications. Every single senior who wanted to apply to college got the support they needed. In the back of the auditorium, a news crew filmed quietly. Roosevelt High's transformation had become a story of hope for other schools facing similar challenges. Already, 3 other districts had reached out for guidance on implementing similar changes. But perhaps the biggest change, Michelle said, her voice softening, is how we see ourselves. We're not just students passing through. We're a community. When one of us faces injustice, we all stand together. When one of us succeeds, we all celebrate. She held up a small button, one of the Stand with Michelle badges students had made months ago. I kept this to remind me that change is possible. That when we stand together, justice wins. That education really can be for everyone. The applause was deafening. Dr. Chen returned to the podium, announcing the school's newest initiative, a scholarship fund for students who showed exceptional commitment to fostering inclusivity and academic excellence. After the assembly in the sunny courtyard, students lingered to talk and take photos. The wall that once displayed only traditional academic achievements now showed a vibrant mix of accomplishments: artistic, cultural, academic, and athletic. Michelle found her mother in the crowd and hugged her tight. "I can't believe how different everything is now," she whispered. Her mother smiled. Sometimes it takes one person's courage to help everyone else find theirs. As the day ended, the setting sun painted Roosevelt High's buildings in warm gold. Students walked out chattering about tomorrow's cultural food festival, next week's leadership workshop, and the upcoming student-led educational equity conference. Principal Davidson's discriminatory regime had become just a memory, a reminder of what happens when people stand up for what's right. In its place stood something beautiful, a school where every student could truly belong, learn, and thrive. The last students leaving campus passed under a new archway. Its words, chosen by the Student Council, summed up Roosevelt High's new chapter perfectly: enter to learn, leave to lead, return to inspire.